Welcome to the 5-Minute Salute, brought to you by the Military Officers Association of America, better known as MOA, Northeast Chapter of Florida. Joining me from the beautiful state of New York is Brett Morash with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Brett, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
No, man, it's great to meet you. You know, we connected on LinkedIn. What a powerful tool. So can you give the audience a little bit of background on you, where you originally from and what you do in the Navy? And then let's talk about HUD. I think there's a misperception of what HUD does or does not do.
For sure. So I grew up in Massachusetts in a little town back then it was a little town called Franklin, which is a burb of Boston nowadays. And I went to a Mass Maritime Academy to be a merchant marine officer.
Yeah.
When I was 6 years old, my grandfather brought me there as a little kid. And I remember getting a tour of the ship by the guy was like 18 years old, but I was like 6. Like the coolest dude I'd ever met. And I'm like, that's where I want to go to school. So that's where I went to school. I still remember he had like a black watch cap and a popped up peak coat. And I'm like, wow, that's the guy I want to be, you know? So went to Mass Maritime, graduated in 93, went in the Navy instead of the Merchant Marine, and then served 20 years as a surface warfare officer, 5 ships, and a joint task force out in East Africa, JTF HOA.
Yep.
Before I retired and got my new second career working primarily with folks living in poverty, starting with the veteran community.
Yeah, that's great. So with HUD, you know, we were talking off camera. What was it? I mean, there's an issue, right, with veteran homelessness. How did you get into that with HUD? And then what are the other ways that, you know, as a greater community we're talking to can help, you know, the greater good of our veterans to get them off the street and back in the society where they should be?
Yeah, so my first job I'd mentioned off camera was that I worked at an organization called Services for the Underserved, which is a large housing provider in New York City, and I was leading up the Veterans Division, working the veteran homelessness issue, which I think everyone probably remembers, like around 2013 was really at the height of it.
Yeah.
A lot of programs are coming on board from the VA, HUD, and Department of Labor, things like that, to really kind of provide the wraparound services for the veteran community. And within about 3 years, they really knocked down those numbers. You know, if you look at New York City now as a good example, the number of veterans that are in the homeless shelter is probably around like the 450 mark. And then the street homeless is much, much, much smaller. But that really accounts for like a 3-month churn of, like, you know, life circumstance happens, people do end up homeless, you know, and then get them back up on step. But I worked in that space for about 9 years. I had an opportunity to come over to HUD, running grants for 4 of the states here in the Northeast. And then this past summer, they asked me to take over the funding branch for all of multifamily housing in the Northeast, which is about $4.5 billion a year.
Wow.
Here at HUD.
So for, you know, because veterans and the American people in general are very generous, or they should be more generous in many cases with charity. What would you recommend for those you know, folks out there listening to this segment? How can they help with veterans homelessness to, you know, almost get every veteran, if not every veteran, off the street?
Absolutely, Chris. And I think one of the challenges that, you know, I see is that a lot of the programs, like a lot of the federal programs, are designed to help big providers get veterans back into like single family housing, primarily like apartments and that sort of thing. But a lot of the money that they don't have is like, and I'll use an example. Like I would be able to get a veteran an apartment, and that was easy. But like the federal government doesn't pay for pots and pans, so you'd be taking a veteran out of, you know, the shelter, putting them in an apartment, paying New York City rent for them, but they didn't have nowhere to like take a shower or anything like that. I mean, like things like towels and stuff. So if you're going to make a donation, take a look at some of the big housing providers and what type of donations they have, because that unrestricted grant is going to go to things like that. That's going to allow people to live their lives in a more normal way.
Yeah, and for the audience, because I think, you know, just growing up, you know, everybody in my neighborhood was a vet from World War II, the Korea, the Vietnam.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's a perception with many Americans, like homeless veterans are, as my kids would say, the old people. I'm like, define old. They're like 50 and older. I'm like, okay, I'm in that group then. But
yeah,
like how much is, you know, this issue? It's timeless, right? So we have a lot of homeless veterans that are under 40, right?
100%. It's pervasive, really, you know, and I think you're right. Like, you know, you had like a a large cadre that were sort of the Vietnam era, but you also had a lot more people in. Also, the Vietnam generation just simply did not have the mental health supports that we have in place for the kind of post 9/11 veteran community. But when you start looking at this, a lot of this is not only a housing crisis, but it's a mental health crisis. So it runs the entire gamut, and you start to see a lot of the 9/11 veterans. I mean, that's who makes a preponderance of the folks that are in the shelter today, in the veteran community.
Well, Brett, one last question for you. If you had one bit of advice for those in service that are getting ready to separate here in the next year or two, what's that one piece of advice you would tell them?
Yeah. So, and I tell everyone this, because we're so wired as veterans to be able to do everything, or be able to be awesome learners and learn any job. I always tell people the easiest way to do it is to actually start to deselect things you don't want to do. And then it becomes easier to kind of find your pathway to things you do want to do, because it is overwhelming coming from the veteran space. And like I said, I was a surface warfare officer.
Yeah.
That skill set's not particularly directly translatable to civilian life, but I do have leadership skills and managing large budgets and stuff like that, and that's what I do now.
Well, Brett, thanks a lot for what you did in the military. Without that, we couldn't do this. Just as important, thanks for what you're doing in your post-military journey. This is awesome to hear. I look forward to staying in contact, and thanks for taking time to tell your story.
Thanks, Chris. Have a great day.
Absolutely. Hey, folks, you like what you heard, please share our content. Take a look at Brett and myself on LinkedIn. Love to connect with you, hear from you. Man, if you got a heart, you got time, treasure, or talent, reach out to some local or even national organizations that can help our veterans get off the street and get back into society where they ought to be as productive citizens. So we'll see our next segment, Live with Gratitude.
When they leave us for battle, we await their return. When their embrace is gone, we imagine them with us. Some don't come back. We grieve. Some come back hurting. We help. Heroes survive. We honor them. Heroes fall. We remember them. 150,000 veterans live in Jacksonville. We serve them. We're the Military Affairs and Veterans Department, City of Jacksonville. Because of them, our light never dims.